welcome to LYF Bible Study. This is lesson 26 of Rabbi, Jesus, the Messiah. It's titled King of Kings of Kings. In Hebrew, that would be Melech Malchai HaMelechim. This is one of the classic titles of God in Jewish thought. It's often thought of as King of Kings. You may recognize that from Scripture, but after the Old Testament period, they actually started calling God the King of Kings because of how many, shall we say, pagan, heathen kings decided they liked the idea of being called the King of Kings, including the Persian Empire, and even some Greek and Roman figures would use similar language. We'll be talking about the second trial of Jesus, and where Jesus fulfills his promise to be brought before kings, but it will turn out to be an opportunity for testimony. As a little bit of review, remember last week we talked about Jesus having been illegally arrested in Gethsemane. He has been illegally questioned by Annas, who is basically the high priest emeritus. He hasn't held the office himself for quite some time, but his son-in-law Caiaphas holds it, his other sons will hold it, his grandson will hold it. Annas is the power behind the high priestly throne. Annas then sends him to Caiaphas, who basically rigs a trial using the fact that he was supposed to be the Av Beit Din, or vice president of the Sanhedrin, before the Pharisees made sure he didn't get the office. And the trial doesn't go well until Jesus basically helps them by giving them enough to falsely accuse him of blasphemy. If he hadn't been who he said he was, of course, what he said would have been blasphemy. But Jesus has had to help them because Jesus is, as we saw last week, fulfilling God's will. The cup cannot pass from Jesus, and so he is not going to do anything that will get him out of this situation. And we left last week with the Sadducees and some of their Pharisee allies taking Jesus to Pontius Pilate. I want to start this with a quote from Isaiah 52, part of the suffering servant discourse or dialogues in Isaiah. "Behold, my servant shall deal prudently. He shall be exalted and extolled and be very high. Just as many were astonished at you, so his visage was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths at him, for what had not been told them they shall see, and what they had not heard they shall consider." And this is one of the many prophecies that Jesus will fulfill in the passages we read today. Remember, we're also not sticking to the Gospel of Luke for the rest of the study. We're still using a primarily Lucan chronology, but we are supplementing quite freely with the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark. So before we get into the text today, I think it's important we go over something of the political background of the time, because this would have been something very evident, I guess I'll say, very evident, very much in the minds of the original readers of this gospel and the original hearers of this gospel, and all of them, in fact. They would have known that this was in the background, and it's something that we need to keep in mind as we read about Pontius Pilate and Jesus' so-called official trial. So Roman and Jewish relations had a long history. About 160 years before Christ, Judah Maccabee, known from the Hanukkah story, had loosely allied with the Roman Republic. There had been a military alliance against the Seleucid Greeks, but the Romans did not get much power from this. The Israelites did not become a client state or anything like that. They had just agreed to military ally with Rome. But about 100 years later, Pompey Magnus, one of the two rulers of Rome at the time, along with Julius Caesar, this is before Caesar crosses the Rubicon and essentially declares himself emperor in all but name, Pompey Magnus sacks Syria, and Syria is, of course, right near Israel. And so Pompey Magnus just decides he's going to go and take over Jerusalem as well. He sacks Jerusalem. He solves a dispute from the Maccabean, also known as the Hasmonean kings, and he appoints Hyrcanus II, not only as the high priest, but as the ethnarch of what is now called the Roman territory of Judea. So the Romans just decided they wanted Judea about 90 years before the passage we're going to be reading today, or passages, I should say, and so they took it militarily. A few years later, Julius Caesar appoints Antipater the Idumean, also known as an Edomite, as the first procurator of Judea. Antipater had allied with Caesar. He had even saved Caesar's life in some accounts. So Caesar, as was quite the norm for Romans, had given his friend political office. And Antipater's son Herod was sent to live in Rome, where he became friends with Octavian, who would later be known as Caesar Augustus. And so 20 years or so after Julius Caesar appoints Antipater the first procurator, the Roman Senate, appoints Antipater's son Herod as the king of the Jews, and the Maccabean line of Hasmonean kings is all eradicated. They're killed off. This man will later become known as Herod the Great. We know him from the Christmas story. 4 BC, Herod dies, and his 3 sons Antipas, Philip, and Archelaus divide up his kingdom. Archelaus gets about a half of it, and he becomes the ethnarch, the tribal leader, as it were, of the Jews, even though he himself is not one. But he just does a terrible job, and he ends up being fired by the Roman Senate by 6 AD. Philip and Antipas, not Archelaus, Philip and Antipas become tetrarchs, so they each rule about a quarter of Herod's kingdom. Archelaus rules half. But once Archelaus demonstrates himself just totally useless, a soldier named Quirinius is appointed the legate of Syria. This is mentioned in Luke's Gospel, and he decides to tax Judea and say Judea is now a subsector of Syria. And he appoints his own procurator or prefect called Coponius. And that's when Quirinius declares that there's going to be a census, which the Israelites don't like because God had judged David for having a census. And things start really going downhill from here. The Jews did not like that they had been forcibly conquered, but they were potentially willing to deal with it. But now the procurators start to really push themselves into Jewish affairs. Before Pontius Pilate, who we'll talk about today, there had been 4 other procurators. None of them lasted especially long. Judea was not particularly a glamorous posting because these problems between the Romans and the Jews had been amping up. The Romans and the Jews were not meant to get along. They have a lot of fundamental differences. First of all, the Jews view Roman religion and culture as vile and sinful, and they are correct. Murder, divorce, infanticide, homosexuality, all things that were anathema to the first century Judean mind are very common in the first century Roman culture. And the Jews also, and again, correctly, view themselves as having been conquered. And now the Roman procurators get to appoint who the high priest is. And they're just meddling in Jewish business. And that is not allowed, that is not liked, that is not respected. And so rebellions become common. The Romans, on the other hand, do not like Jews. The Romans, remember, their religion is very civic. They view politics as a sacred thing. And that's why they call their emperors divine. And the Jews are having none of that. They don't like that the Jews don't worship images and that they only worship one God. It's just confusing. And they also don't like the way that the Jews infight. You know, Pharisees versus Sadducees, even inter-Sadducee debates. The Jews are just totally mysterious to the Roman mind. And so this is setting the stage for some serious squabbles down the line for when Pontius Pilate, pictured here, is appointed governor. He's appointed by Emperor Tiberius a few years, around 3 to 6, depending on the dating, before Jesus is executed. He ramps things up. He becomes more involved in Jewish life and their religious affairs than those who had come before him. In fact, almost immediately after he becomes procurator, he takes away the Sanhedrin's right to exercise capital punishment. They had had a limited right to put people to death, and then Pilate took it away from them. He really wanted to crush the Jews. He increasingly cracked down on the Jews. He kept trying to forcibly assimilate them, bringing in, religious symbols of Roman culture into the city of Jerusalem, and just constantly fighting with Jewish leadership. Some other things to know about Pilate. He held the title Amicus Caesaris, friend of Caesar. Now, the emperor at this time is Tiberius, and he is towards the end of his life. He had retired, in fact, to the Isle of Capri, where we have some accounts of what he did. They may be a little bit sensationalized, but he basically retired to get drunk, have sex, and just be kind of a vile person all around. And because of this, he had retired to do all this, but he was still emperor. There had been an attempt to supplant him and overthrow him and put someone else on the throne, and he put it down with a lot of force. And he was known as somebody it was not worth crossing. And some people thought he might even be a little bit insane. By the time we get to Jesus' trial, Tiberius has already reprimanded Pilate. Pilate had tried to bring in shields and banners to Jerusalem. These would have had the title of the emperor on it, including the claim that he was a son of God. And the Jews of all stripes were like, this is a holy city, you can't bring those in here. Pilate had said, yes, I can, and Tiberius had told him, no, you can't, and don't ever do that again. So Pilate is in control of a really it's a powder keg. That's the best way I can think to describe it. It's a powder keg of political intrigue at this point. And he works along mostly Hellenized Jews, so Jews who have adopted Greek culture, and some of the Sadducee elites to try to maintain his control over Judea and Galilee. And by most accounts, certainly all the early ones from church history and from Josephus, he wasn't particularly good at it. He wasn't exactly a good ruler. There's a description of Pilate that I found in some of the older commentaries from the 17th century and well into the 18th, in fact. It uses a Middle English term to describe Pilate as feckless. This is Middle English that we don't really have a good word in modern English for it. It's a wonderfully strong word, and it means incompetent, of little effect, feeble, weak, spineless. Pilate was a feckless man. He wanted to be this strong dictatorial power, but he always got cowed. His legacy has not been particularly favorably looked upon. It wasn't until several hundred years later, when the Roman Empire became a nominally Christian country, that some people tried to redeem Pilate, say he wasn't guilty of Jesus' death, he was this wonderful guy, he was actually a saint. All the early traditions, however, they don't like him, and we'll see why in our passages today. So we're going to start with the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verses 28 through 32. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate then went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered and said to him, "If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you." Then Pilate said to them, "You take him and judge him according to your law." And therefore the Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death," that the saying of Jesus what might be fulfilled which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. Really quickly, this is a source of a lot of debate about chronology, when it says that they don't want to enter the praetorium because they will become unclean and they can't eat the Passover. People say this is a lack of lining up between John and the three synoptic Gospels. It is actually quite easily reconciled if you look at other early texts. Some people said, oh, well, this means that it's the first day of Passover, so Jesus must have kept an early Passover. He couldn't have eaten the Paschal lamb on Maundy Thursday. But there were multiple sacrifices that would be offered through Passover. The Paschal lamb, as we talked about last week, would actually be killed the day before Passover, and then that night, which is the start of Passover in Jewish numbering, remember, day begins at night. There was evening and there was morning the first day. So that was the Paschal lamb was offered the day before, but you couldn't become ritually unclean so that you could not eat the Paschal lamb. But you could become ritually unclean so that you could not eat the Chagigah, which is the festival sacrifice unique to the three pilgrimage festivals of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And that's most likely what they're talking about here. They're like, we can't enter a Gentile house because we'll be unclean and no one can eat this for us and we won't be able to eat of it. So they don't want to get in. They don't want to go into the praetorium, but they want Pilate to serve basically as their tool for executing Jesus. So they try an excuse. And they say, well, if he were not an evildoer, we would not have brought him to you. They just want this over with quickly. They're kind of relying here on Pilate's tyranny. They're like, oh yeah, we just tell him this is a bad dude. He's already going to be on edge because it's Passover and there have been a bunch of revolts lately. He'll kill him and it'll be done. It'll be over simply. But Pilate doesn't get on very well with really any of the Jews, and so his response is very political. And he basically taunts them. He's like, you take him and you execute him. And there's a political dynamic here where they have to basically admit from the start, we're nothing without you. You're the only one with authority because it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death, and we want you to kill this person. So the politics of Pilate's, responses to the Jewish leaders during Jesus' trial are really important to keep in mind because they explain Pilate's own responses. Jumping into a harmony of the gospel, starting with Luke 23, verse 2, and they began to accuse him, saying, we found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus answered him, are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me? Pilate answered, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. Pilate therefore said to him, are you a king then? Jesus answered, you say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Pilate said to him, what is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no fault in him at all. But they were the more fierce, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place. So we have the first of several dialogues that St. John gives us between Pilate and Jesus. It can be easily inferred from John's gospel that now that Peter has fled, John darts in and out of this narrative. John is potentially even in the palace at this time. John, we know, stands by the foot of the cross later until he is finally dismissed. So John may have actually witnessed this firsthand, maybe through a door or something, or at least heard it, and that this might be why he gives us this more intimate depiction of these debates. It's really interesting that Pilate focuses on the accusation of Christ's kingship. He doesn't focus on some of the other accusations that they've said. They're saying, oh, he forbade to pay taxes to Caesar. He hones in on that accusation against Christ that he's a king, because if Jesus is a king, an earthly king, he's rebelling against Caesar's authority, and Pilate can put him to death. But this is also something relatively unique, because plenty of people forbade paying taxes to Caesar. That was just a common thing because it wasn't viewed as lawful. But only a Messiah, of whom there had been several at this point, and I don't mean that in the sense there were several actual Messiahs, but there had been several who claimed to be the Messiah by this point. They said they were king. So Pilate is honing in on that. And Jesus, even here almost at the peak, not quite, but almost at the peak of his humiliation, preaches the gospel, and he asks questions, and he offers salvation to Pilate. He wants to engage with Pilate honestly, and Pilate does not do so. And when he finally scorns Jesus, when Jesus preaches the free offer of the gospel, saying, those who hear the truth hear my voice, Pilate just goes, what is truth? This phrase has been sometimes called Pilate's moral suicide, because the truth of the gospel is proclaimed in his presence, and he rejects it and avoids it. What's worth noting in this dialogue is that Jesus has not given Pilate enough to condemn him. Pilate, if he really wanted to, sure, he wouldn't really need to do anything. He was the procurator. He could put down anyone as a rebel if he really wanted to. But nothing Jesus has said would warrant that. Jesus is, again, shaping things that he will be crucified for the right reasons. He's not about to actively rebel against Caesar or say anything that could justly get him convicted of treason against Caesar. He will be killed because he is the Son of God. He will be killed on that claim. So while Pilate obviously despises this Hebrew theology of a non-earthly kingdom, because the Romans were very materialistic, he also can acknowledge nothing that Jesus has said is actually traitorous. This is just some weird Eastern Jewish mysticism. So that's why Jesus' accusers start to ramp things up a bit, and they say, well, he stirs up the people, and he teaches throughout all places, all of Judea, from Galilee to here. And they're trying to once again appeal to Pilate to get him to act swiftly and brutally. Pilate has a history of putting down rebellions, especially in Galilee. He's been fighting the Zealots for a long time now. And so they think, okay, we can get him to do this. This isn't hard. But it doesn't go their way, as we'll see. We're going to come back to Luke's Gospel now, chapter 23, verses 6 through 12. When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked if the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. Now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired for a long time to see him, because he had heard many things about him, and he hoped to see some miracle done by him. Then he questioned him with many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. Then Herod, with his men of war, treated him with contempt and mocked him, arrayed in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. That very day, Pilate and Herod became friends with each other, for previously they had been with enmity with each other. We've met Herod before, so just for a little bit of review, he's one of Herod the Great's sons. He's the Tetrarch of Galilee and Perea at Augustus's decree. He's a bit of a weird one. Philip went basically full Hellenist. Archelaus was trying to be more like a Judean, but he was just an inept governor. Herod wasn't bad as a tetrarch, but he did have some enemies. But he really wanted to rule over a peaceful section of the land. He wanted to reconcile Hellenized and faithful Jews, but he was unsuccessful because the faithful Jews stuck to their guns, and they're like, we're not coming into we're not settling your city here when you're having pigs in it, and pigs are being sacrificed here, and you have Greeks sacrificing to their gods. That is unclean. But he at least had this interest. He'd also fought with Pilate before. When Pilate had brought Roman civic religion in the form of these shields and banners that said that Caesar was a god, he tried to bring those into Jerusalem, and Antipas said, this is a bad idea. I'm going to go to Tiberias if you don't do this. And Pilate said, fine, go ahead, go to Tiberias. Not remembering that Tiberius would have remembered that Antipas's father, and Tiberius was the adopted son of Augustus, so their fathers had been friends for a very long time, from their youth, in fact. So naturally, Tiberius sided with Antipas because of that relationship with the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the house of Herod. Also worth remembering that Antipas had murdered John the Baptist at his stepdaughter's request, and also the request of his brother's wife, who he'd stolen. He'd made his fortune selling balm of Gilead as an aphrodisiac. He did not have a good reputation in Israel. He was known for being sexually immoral and a pleasure seeker. But again, he was kind of interested in the trappings and teachings of Tanakhic Judaism. He was interested in this idea of the Old Testament religion. And here's this holy man, this crazy Galilean holy man who's coming around. I just killed John the Baptist. Now there's somebody even bigger. And we've seen earlier in the Gospels, in fact, that Herod has really wanted to see Jesus for a long time. He's interested in this guy. It's also worth keeping in mind, though, what Jesus' perspective is going to be on this. Both John and Luke and Matthew, in fact, even references the idea that when Jesus learned of the death of John the Baptist, he went off to be by himself. He yelled at the children of Israel around him and went off to be it himself because he knew what it represented, and he was grieving over someone who we must remember was his cousin. John was his cousin. John was the first man, even though when John was still in the womb when he did this, who recognized who Jesus was. They knew each other. And so now he is standing in front of a man who murdered somebody dear to him. He's also standing in front of a man who bears the title King of the Jews and has no right to. He's a mixed-blooded man of Jewish and Idumean, that's Edomite, Esau's descendants, ancestry. He's not Davidic. His throne was given to him by Augustus, who declared himself to be both a son of a god and a god himself. There is nothing valid about Herod's kingship, and there's nothing valid about Herod. So Jesus doesn't offer the gospel to Herod like he did to Pilate. Because remember, even in Isaiah 52 that we read earlier, he will say things to those who have not heard it before, but Herod's heard it before. Herod has no interest in hearing the actual gospel. He just wants a sign. And Jesus has been reluctant before to perform signs just because people want to see them, because signs are tied to messages. And since Herod has no interest in the message of Jesus, Jesus is not about to indulge him. Jesus also, again, does not want to escape what he has committed to. Another political interpretation that's worth looking at here is Pilate sending Jesus to Herod. It says in the Gospel of Luke this made them into friends because Pilate is now actually recognizing Herod's authority as Tetrarch of Galilee. Herod did have the right by Roman law to try Jesus, and Pilate sending him a peace offering, perhaps out of a bit of worry that this is going to go south for Pilate and he needs an ally. And it seems to have worked. Something else to note here, the gorgeous robe, in Greek, estheta lampran, again, my Greek pronunciation is awful, is likely a reference to Jesus's, what some have called his funeral oration for John the Baptist in Luke 7 and Matthew 11. He even says, "What did you go out to see? A reed shaken by the wind, but what did you go out to see? A man clothed in splendid apparel? But behold, those who are in splendid apparel dwell in kings' houses." So it's likely that Herod is aware what Jesus has been saying about him and is sending him back in mockery. Jesus also rebuked Herod in Luke 13, calling him a fox, and told the Pharisees to go back and tell him this. Nevertheless, Jesus hasn't given Herod a reason to execute him again. And remember that Herod wasn't even that enthusiastic about murdering John. He locked John up for preaching against him, but he had to be coerced into killing John, and it seems he's afraid to do the same thing to Jesus here. So he just passes the buck back to Pilate, and he's like, thank you for the honor, but yeah, no, I don't want to deal with this. So moving on with Luke's account, verses 13 through 22, "Then Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, said to them, 'You have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people. And indeed, having examined him in your presence, I have found no fault in this man concerning those things of which you accuse him. No, neither did Herod, for I sent you back to him, and indeed nothing deserving of death has been done by him. I will therefore chastise him and release him.' For it was necessary for him to release one to them at the feast, and they all cried out at once, saying, 'Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, who had been thrown into prison for a certain rebellion made in the city, and for murder.' Pilate, therefore wishing to release Jesus, again called out to them, but they shouted, saying, 'Crucify him! Crucify him!' Then he said to them the third time, 'Why, what evil has he done? I have found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go.'" We're going to move to Matthew's parallel account, verses 15 through 20 of Matthew 27. "Now at the feast the governor was accustomed to releasing to the multitude one prisoner whom they wished. And at that time they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Therefore when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, 'Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?' For he knew that they had handed him over because of envy. While he was sitting at the throne of judgment, or he was sitting on the judgment seat, rather, his wife sent to him, saying, 'Have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him.' But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor answered and said to them, 'Which of the two do you want me to release to you?' They said, 'Barabbas.'" Some things to go over here. Barabbas, it is a Greek version of the Aramaic Bar Abba, which means son of the father. We know nothing else about Barabbas besides his name and his accusation of being a rebel and a murderer. And there's a reason for that, because Barabbas is, he's pictured here. He is a picture of what it is Jesus is doing. Jesus is the son of the Father, and he is given to sacrifice and serves as a ransom for this other son of the Father, a rebel and a murderer. The same language, by the way, that is used to describe sin and the state of sin. St. Paul uses it all the time. This is the picture of substitutionary atonement. Jesus is dying to justify us and lead us to be adopted by the Father and recognized as sons. But it's an either or. One has to be released, but someone has to die. Some early texts even give Barabbas his first name to be Yeshua, so Jesus. There is debate on this subject. It is certainly not in the Textus Receptus, which is the one that I personally think should be trusted the most, but it's an interesting early tradition. Why is Pilate releasing prisoners, of course? Well, it's a political move. Remember, he comes to the city during the feast season to execute people, to give judgment. He comes there to make some potentially very unpopular decisions. And so he's kind of giving them a bone, as it were, to try to pacify them when he does these things. So he's like, oh, I'll just use this and I'll get this off my back. He's trying to outmaneuver his political opponents. He's trying to be political about this. He doesn't want to get involved. And he's like, oh yeah, I'll just give them a choice that's no choice at all. A murderous rebel over somebody who they just don't like for religious reasons. Surely they're not going to pick that. Obviously that doesn't work. Pilate's wife, this is the only time she appears. She is given the name Procula in early church tradition. And in later tradition, she's called Claudia Procula. Some people say she's a saint. Some people say she's just a Jewish proselyte. We know that the previous procurator to Pilate had been Valerius Gratus, and his wife had been a proselyte. She did basically start the conversion process to Jewish religion. Some people say that Martin Luther is on this side. He says that her dream was an attempt by Satan to stop salvation. But early church fathers like Augustine and Jerome, as well as many other reformers, say that no, it came from God. That doesn't mean she's a saint. We don't know anything about her, but this is a test of Pilate as well. Pilate's mettle is going to be proved here, and it's going to fail. Because Pilate has now been warned. He should know better than to do what he's about to do. He can see, it says in Matthew's gospel, he knows they're just envious of Jesus. He knows this is absolutely a sham. And now his wife is telling him, don't do this. I've had a dream about this. This is a bad idea. But he does it anyway. John chapter 19, verses 1 through 3. So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. Then they said, Hail, King of the Jews! And they struck him with their hands. Some version of this passage appears in all the Gospels. The scourging scene, if you have ever seen The Passion of the Christ, it's one of the most controversial scenes in that movie. It's been a favorite subject of church art for almost all 2,000 years of Christian history. But especially in more later censored church art, where we want to see the crucifixion, but we don't want to be too reminded of what it was. We've kind of lost the idea of what scourging is. Scourging was actually an execution method itself, especially in military context. You would scourge you to death, and it was a standard part of the crucifixion process. It was called the intermediate death. And you'd be scourged before you were crucified because that would make it hurt more, and you'll see why in a second. Even high-ranking Romans like Tacitus and the orator Cicero, they didn't like scourging. They thought scourging was barbaric, even of non-Romans. And there are several instances from Roman histories where somebody was scourged not to kill them, but they died anyway. Like if you were scourged, you were probably going to die. Traditionally, it's said that Jesus was scourged 39 times. This comes from the Old Testament. You can only strike someone 40 minus 1 times. The Romans had no such tradition, but we can grant it for the sake of argument. Scourging is a death sentence, 9 times out of 10. And Pilate is wussing out here. Pilate is being a feckless man, an ineffective, spineless coward. If Jesus is scourged, he is going to die, most likely. Whether it's due to blood loss, trauma, shock, infection, what have you. He's trying to give the Jews what they want while assuaging his own conscience, and he's really solving nothing and fixing nothing. He doesn't want a revolt that gets him in trouble with Caesar. He doesn't want to kill Jesus. He doesn't see why he should. He doesn't want the Jews causing a revolt. And he's not committing to anything. He's just being a coward. These are Roman flagellum. These are 2 different versions. These are, you might almost say, nicer ones. You notice they have metal barbs on the ends. We've actually have archaeological evidence and remnants. Obviously, the leather doesn't preserve really well over 2,000 years, but we have some of these metal spikes. They would also often put animal bones and other things in there. They did not keep these clean, so they were just filthy. During a scourging, you would be stripped of your clothing. You'd have your hands tied to an uptight post, and you would have your back buttocks and upper thighs, and legs flogged by 1 or 2 lictors. Either they'd have 2, 1 on either side of you, or 1 who would switch sides with every stroke. Scourging was designed to weaken you almost to the point of death, to make crucifixion hurt that much. The iron balls or the bones attached to the straps would cause deep cuts. They would cut through the skin, cut through the subcutaneous tissue, cut into the muscles. Pain and blood loss would set the stage for circulatory shock, and depending how much blood you lost, that would determine how long you lasted on the cross. But even a few scourgings, this is from a simulation, and this is as nice as I can get it in terms of lack of horror, but we need to confront this. 1 lash alone would be a horrific injury, and again, this is just on the back. By 8 lashes, you're in more horror territory. By 20 lashes, you've essentially been flayed. And even if we grant that it was only 39 lashes, in the Old Testament, they did not use a flagellum. It was not designed as an execution method. If you were hit with a flagellum 39 times, you would emerge from that process barely looking human. The Passion of the Christ basically, if anything, it downplayed what Jesus would have looked like after his scourging. This was not Pilate just having Jesus spanked. This was having him tortured. Also remember that in the Garden of Gethsemane, he's bled through his sweat pores. Jesus has bled through his sweat pores, a process that would leave his skin agonizingly tender. And after they essentially flay his back, they throw a rough sponge cloak on him in the Roman imperial color of scarlet or purple, and they jam a crown of thorns onto his head. This is Sisyphus spina Christ. It is known as the Christ thorn jujube. It's believed to be the most likely candidate for what the crown of thorns were made of. What they were made of doesn't really matter. The point is, he was now, in addition to being beaten almost to death, a bloody, soaked mass. He's now getting thorns that is going to have blood dripping into his eyes, the front of his head that's been spared so far. Pain is now being hurt, and he's been tortured. John chapter 19, verses 1 through 11 continues this narrative. Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold, the man." Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to our law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." Therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid, and went again into the praetorium, and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you?" Jesus answered, "You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Pilate's still trying to be a coward. He's still trying to avoid the choice in front of him. So he's basically showing Jesus, he's like, "Hey, look, I tortured him. He's been beaten to within an inch of his life. He's probably going to die. I've even mockingly given him the trappings of a king here. Surely this will satisfy them." It, of course, produces the opposite effect. The Sadducees and their allies and this mob, they don't just want Jesus beaten. They don't want the idea that they don't just want to see that he might die, that he even has a good chance of dying. They want him dead. They want this over with. They want this done before evening. And once again, Pilate just exacerbates the situation by saying, "Well, you take him and crucify him." And they're like, "We can't. You took away that power, so here you go." And they actually show their hand here. They even say, "We want him dead because he's a blasphemer. He said he was the Son of God." Now this troubles Pilate, especially because the idea of demigods was not exactly alien to them. Remember, all the Caesars claimed to be gods and the sons of God, so Pilate would be naturally troubled by this, and he wants Jesus to give him something. He wants anything that takes this out of his hand. Now, yes, Pilate is being a coward, but Jesus does have an out here. He could say something that gets him off, but he doesn't. He stays silent. Again, per Isaiah 53, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. So he's quiet because Pilate's first question has been answered. Jesus said he came from above. Jesus has said, my kingdom is not of this world, and he's proclaimed the gospel of truth, and Pilate isn't willing to hear it. But then Pilate basically says, I have the power of life and death, and now Jesus rebukes him. He's basically saying, no. Romans believed that they had a divine right to conquer the world, given by Yahweh Pater, also known as Jupiter or Jove, because Yahweh Pater had made this covenant, you might almost say, with the Romans' second king, Numa, and he said, as long as they were good Romans, basically, you have the right to do whatever you want. And Jesus is saying, your authority comes from God, and Pilate's not about to confuse this for Jesus suddenly giving in to the Greek or Roman myths. So again, Pilate seems to miss the point, though, because Jesus does say, the one who delivered you to me, they are the ones with the greater sin. So he's like, Jesus is only rebuking the Jewish leaders. I have an out here. So going again into a harmony of the Gospels, from then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, behold your king! But they cried out, away with him, crucify him! Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it. And all the people answered and said, his blood be on us and our children. Then he delivered him to them to be crucified. Then they took Jesus and led him away. So Pilate has been totally politically outmaneuvered. Remember, he holds this title, Amicus Caesaris, but he's already on Tiberius's bad side because Herod ratted out what Pilate was doing. And if he stays on Tiberius's bad side, he has a good chance of ending up dead. If the court of the Sanhedrin goes to Caesar and says, Pilate is allowing other people to say that they're kings besides the ones you've approved, O mighty Caesar, Pilate might actually be killed. The Jews, meanwhile, are getting more desperate because it's about noon. The Gospel of John uses Roman timing. So it's the 6th hour from dawn. So Caiaphas is actually probably already left from this multitude. He's gone. He's sacrificed the Chagigah. And they're in a time crunch. They want to eat it before the evening. That's the proper time to go and eat this part of the Passover and celebrate the Passover. And they can't get unclean, and they're getting desperate. And that leads them to say two things that are, I think, the crux of these passages. And they're two of the, I think, saddest verses in all of Scripture. We have no king but Caesar. This is the epitome of blasphemy. Caesar claims that his right is given to him by pagan gods. Caesar has illegitimately conquered Judea. Caesar is an evil man, and he's not their God. And it's the priests who say this, and they should know better, because the claim, and this is just one instance where God makes this claim, by the way, throughout all the Tanakh, all the Old Testament, God has said, I am the Lord, your Holy One, the Creator of Israel, your King. In fact, there's even a parallel here to all the way back in 1 Samuel 8, before David was even anointed, when Samuel was getting old. And some scholars call this the period of theocratic anarchy, because each man does what is right in his own eyes. God would raise up judges, but the judges weren't kings. They delivered Israel, and then they would be kind of like an arbitrator or a judge, but they weren't kings. And Samuel was the last judge, and the people come to Samuel and say, give us a king to judge us like all the other nations. And then Samuel's angry, and we see in verses 6 through 8 of chapter 8 that he goes to God. And the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of this people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Remember also, if you were with us for the book Kings study, I believe that was last summer, we talked about Samuel as a type of Christ. Samuel is a prophet. He's also a priest who can offer sacrifices. He is a Levite. And he's a king in the sense that he is a judge. He is the executive, if you will, to use a modern political term. And they reject him. Even though he had been anointed by God to serve over them, they reject him and say they want a king like the other nations. And God applies this rejection of Samuel's God-ordained reign to idolatry. He says this is idolatry, serving other gods. Well, that's literally what they're doing here by saying we have no king but Caesar. They're saying we reject this Messiah, the son of David, who has the right to reign over us. We have no king but Caesar, who is also, claiming to be a god. This is the most absurd, blatant blasphemy. But then the next, even more infamous passage, his blood be on us and our children. The passage is only in the Gospel of Matthew that says this. It says that all the people say this. Now, not literally. Obviously, the entire city they probably weren't even all awake yet. But it's a multitude that does this. And they're inverting a part of the Tanakh and the Torah even that they would pray every day. Lay not innocent blood to thy people of Israel's charge. They're inverting it. Because he's saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. This man is innocent. He's a just man. I'm declaring him just, but sure, you can kill him if you want. And they say, well, fine, let his blood be on us and our children. It is a horrifying rejection of covenant. Now, yes, it is literally fulfilled 40 years later. At this very spot, some of the, most likely even the sons of these men, would be judged and executed by Titus at this same praetorium. One thing it is not, and I feel this is important because it gets brought up a lot, especially by John Chrysostom, who is considered a saint by some. He was a 3rd and early 4th, I believe, century church leader who came up with the crime of deicide. And he said that no Jew could ever be saved, even if they accepted Jesus, because the blood guilt had been put on all Jews, and they could never be forgiven because they had said his blood be on us and our children. This has become very popular. In fact, it makes up part of the Maundy Thursday liturgies in the Eastern Orthodox and some parts of the Roman Catholic Church. The words of Chrysostom do. But that's not what the Bible says. This is not this is not the moment when God says he's done with the Jews. And we'll definitely come back to this with the book of Acts. But I'll just give this passage from Ezekiel. Yet you say, why should the Son not bear the guilt of the Father? Because the Son has done what is lawful and right, and has kept all my statutes and observed them. He shall surely live. The soul who sins shall die. The Son shall not bear the guilt of the Father, nor the Father bear the guilt of the Son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. So this is not like an excuse to go hunt down and murder Jews like it's been used for the past 2,000 years. It's not. And St. Paul makes that very clear earlier what we talked about earlier in the book of Romans. But what it is saying, okay, fine. If anything, it's ironic because they say his blood be upon us and our children, but that's what they need. Because, looking at Isaiah 52, by doing this, he sprinkles many. Jesus, you sprinkled the blood of the lamb on top of the mercy seat when the high priest sacrificed, because it would dwell between the representation of Israel and the very presence of God. The blood would cover them. So even though what they're saying in the moment is actually blasphemous, there's almost this Caiaphas-like prophecy without knowing you're prophesying element to it, because that's what we should say. That's what we should all pray, for the sake of Christ, for Christ's blood have mercy on us. So as we conclude this passage about Jesus' trial, there's this question that remains. Who killed Jesus? And there have been several options, 3, I've narrowed it down to, that have been thought of by the church throughout time. Some people say it was Pilate. He's a feckless man. He refuses to do his job. He washes his hands, but you know what? He's the one with the power. If he really wanted to, he could have released Jesus. He obviously didn't want to enough. There's the Sadducees and their Pharisee allies who convened an illegal court to condemn Jesus to death and then just use the Romans as their executioners. There's the Jewish people rejecting their Messiah and taking his guilt on themselves. And there's an element of truth to all of this. Pilate is a terrible man and a terrible ruler. The Sadducees are corrupt and evil. And yeah, this is a lynch mob. Jesus is being put to death by a lynch mob right now. They're calling for Jesus' blood. But ultimately, all of them are wrong. The answer is found in Scripture itself, and this would be a lot cooler if somehow mirrors worked during or through the computer, but they don't. So there's just a picture of a mirror. But in Isaiah 53, we read, "He was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." From Acts chapter 2, St. Peter's own discourse on Pentecost that we just read in church the other day. "Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves also know. Him, being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God, you have taken by lawless hands, have crucified, and put to death." And just as in this same sentiment is Jesus' own words of John 10, verses 17 through 18. "Therefore my Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I may take it again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. This command I have received from my Father." And finally, we have Genesis 3:15. "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." Ultimately, we are responsible for Jesus' death because he died for the sins of the world, and we are a part of the world. But Jesus willingly goes to the cross. This is the Father's bargain with the Son. If there is going to be salvation from the moment of the fall, if there's going to be any hope of salvation, Jesus will have to die. The Son makes this agreement, and therefore the Father loves him. It is Jesus who makes this decision. So if you have to find somebody who's guilty of Jesus' death, you can look in the mirror. But this is not an issue of blame as much as it is a terrible and a wonderful thing, because Jesus is dying, or about to die in the terms of where we're studying. He will be put to death for our sins. We will return next week for the account of the crucifixion.